Going on, Packers fans? Aaron Nagler here, joined by very special guest Paul Bretl from ESPN LaCrosse. Paul, how are you today?
I'm excellent, Aaron. Always happy to be talking Packers football with you.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about something that's very important to the Green Bay
hmm
Packers, and that is the Senior Bowl. I know you had a piece go up earlier today, actually, and I'll link to it in the description of this video about the importance of the Senior Bowl when it comes to the Green Bay Packers draft process, the guys that they've eventually drafted. Though it is funny reading your piece how often Gutekunst kind of goes out of his way to say it's not by design
Right.
that they're drafting all these guys who come through the Senior Bowl, but it's very clear that the event itself, the practices and the game, they're pretty damn important.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And like you said, Gutekunst's own words, not by design. They don't go into the draft saying, "All right, we got to get 4 Senior Bowl guys this year." But
Right.
from how things have unfolded, it would appear that that's a big part of the equation over the last 3 drafts. So going back to 2022, Packers have made 35 total selections during that 3-year span. 18 of them, so over half, have been participants in the Senior Bowl. And that includes last year's draft, where they had 11 picks in total, and 8 of them were Senior Bowl participants. The only players who weren't were Edgerrin Cooper, Tyron Hopper, and Jacob Monk. And some of the past Senior Bowl participants who are obviously playing big roles on the Packers roster right now: Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Luke Musgrave, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks. And then even going back to the 2020 draft, Jordan Love was a Senior Bowl participant. So as this week unfolds, we will see on Twitter the clips of one-on-one matchups, measurables, all of that stuff taking place. Pay attention to who those names are, because it's not just 1 or 2 of those guys might end up Green Bay Packers, but recent history tells us multiple of them are going to be.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned that litany of names, right? And there's no doubt that obviously the tape, the games that these kids have played in college and throughout their collegiate careers are kind of the bedrock of the evaluation. But
Mm-hmm.
I do like what Brian said last year when he was asked about it, as far as getting to see these guys in a little bit different circumstances, especially going against some of the better competition that's on offer. The guys that you just mentioned, Jaden Reed. I mean, that's a guy who I think really turned heads at the
Mm-hmm.
Senior Bowl because he had been kind of relegated to the idea that he had to play in the slot and could only do things from the slot. And Senior Bowl week, he really was featured all over the place in the slot and on the perimeter. And he turned a lot of heads that week. And I think that's probably the kind of thing where you can look at the tape and what they were asked to do in college, but that doesn't mean that's all they can do. And this week feels like a good time for the Packers to get an eye on who's maybe pushed outside their comfort zone a little bit, but certainly seems to rise to that occasion.
Yeah, that's a big element of this. Obviously, it's an all-star game. There's a ton of draft eligible prospects here. It's not terribly surprising that each team has multiple Senior Bowl selections on their draft picks. It comes with the territory of being an all-star event, but there's specific qualities about the event that Brian Gutekunst really likes. One, it's the willingness of the prospects to participate in it, because it is a highly competitive week of practices. The game, that doesn't much matter. I think I've heard that most of the GMs and scouts are gone
Right.
by the time the game
Yep.
rolls around on Saturday. But the practices, specifically, as Gutekunst mentioned, the unscripted nature of it. It's not putting together your offensive game plan to go out and execute at a high level on Saturday. It is competitive one-on-ones, offensive line, defensive line, wide receivers versus cornerbacks, highly competitive situations where they're seeing how these players perform against the best of the best in a situation where they know there's a ton of eyes on them. And in addition to that, there's the opportunity for the scouts, the general managers, whoever it might be, to meet with these players one-on-one. This is likely for many of these individuals within the organization the first time to, as you mentioned, see these players in person on the football field. It's also the first time to really interact with them, at least in a more of a one-on-one opportunity. And we all know that's an important part of the pre-draft process as well. And there's a couple of prospects from last year where Gutekunst and the VP of Player Personnel, John Eric Sullivan, mentioned the significance that the Senior Bowl played in their evaluation. One is Travis Glover, so a Georgia State product. But Gutekunst mentioned seeing how he competed during Senior Bowl week against Power 5 competition put him further on the Packers' radar as they dove deeper into the pre-draft process. Evan Williams, Packers were looking for that do-it-all safety, play deep, play in the box, play in the nickel. And John Eric Sullivan said that the way that in person, as you mentioned, versus the tape, in person, seeing how Evan Williams was able to move in space gave the Packers the confidence that, hey, he can play the nickel if needed. He can handle all three of these safety responsibilities. So it's little things like that from those in-person reps that you see that, again, these players they're on the Packers radar in general, but maybe you take a deeper dive, you take a closer look into what they're capable of.
And it's funny you mentioned the proximity and the ability to get these guys not just one-on-one, but to see them live in person up close during these one-on-one reps. And this year, the Packers have a bit more of a foothold because of Jason Vrabel, the passing game coordinator, being the offensive coordinator for one of the teams at the Senior Bowl. And like you said, the game is maybe not an afterthought, but it's not the main event here. But the fact that he is going to be directing and calling plays and seeing how guys react to certain calls, situations, adjustments, etc., that's just another kind of not a feather in the cap, but it's another kind of foothold in the ability to see these guys up close and respond to your coaching from one of your coaching staff.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Jason Vrabel is going to be the offensive coordinator for the national team, I believe. And then Wendell Davis, who's the Packers defensive quality control coach. I know he works a lot with the defensive linemen. He's actually going to be the linebackers coach in this event for the American team. So you have two coaches within the Packers organization, as you said, are going to get that up close and personal look at these players from the conversations. How do they respond to coaching? Specifically the exact type of play that's drawn up for them. Well, when things go awry, how do they respond in that moment? Are they still able to win their matchup? I mean, there's such a trickle-down effect from just what's the play call? What'd you go out there and do? What's the defense doing or the offense? How do you respond to that? So there's some additional, I think, nuance that the Packers are going to an additional perspective in that regard that the Packers are going to get. And I would certainly think that Brian Gutekunst is going to call upon Vrabel and Wendell to provide some of that insight to their big board as they're evaluating these prospects throughout the process, because that's really, really valuable time that these Packers coaches are going to have with them.
I'm looking forward to this week and social media blowing up with all the one-on-ones, which will certainly be on offer wherever you turn. It is fascinating, though, because I try not to get too excited by it, right? It is a practice, and it is, especially when you're talking about those one-on-ones between a wide receiver and a defensive back. The defensive backs are in a world of pain in those drills. But you look at somebody like Ladd McConkey last year, who had an outstanding week at the Senior Bowl and then went on to have a pretty phenomenal rookie season. It's not that you can't translate, right? That just because you're doing it on air or against one-on-one competition in a drill, you can see traits, right? You can project as far as their ability in the NFL to go against some of the better competition on offer. It's a balancing act, because I don't want to tell people, well, everything you see on social media doesn't mean anything. It's just you have to have a little bit of perspective and take it with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean you're terrible if you lose that kind of one drill that gets put up on social, but it also can be instructive to where maybe that is something the player needs to work on, or a real strength of the guy who wins that one-on-one. It's just fascinating to me to see how much that drives conversation at this time of the season.
Yeah, and that's the important part to all of this, is the nuance, the context behind it. And to me, that's the beautiful part about football, right? I know we all want to identify what's the one thing that made this play work, what's the one thing that didn't work, who's this one prospect that's going to solve all the issues, but there's so much that goes into making all of that work or not work in certain instances. And I think being in person, again, that element to it's so important. The scouts there, the GMs, we talked about the Packers coaches being a part of the entire week with these players, because you get that up close look, you get the context behind it. You know what the exact play call is, you know what the exact responsibility is, you know how they're supposed to respond. And when things go wrong, how do they respond in that moment? Right. And like you said, it can help pinpoint where you're at in your evaluation process with that player, right? You got your pros, you got your cons, and that week at the Senior Bowl can help you really hone in on, yes, these are the pros, or maybe we should go back and look at this one. So hopefully it's one tool in the Packers tool belt when it comes to draft evaluation. It can help confirm what you've seen on tape, what you've identified so far, or it can be an opportunity for you to go back and say, all right, we gotta relook at this trait, this component, this players in these certain type of situations, to hopefully, from the Packers' perspective, strengthen your evaluation. So then you're making more sound draft picks, more sound decision making when that time comes. And as we talked about from the players listed earlier, who the Packers have drafted from the Senior Bowl, there's a lot of key contributors there, right? There's a lot of high impact players on this Packers team who are part of this event. And again, I really think that up close, personal component to it is such a crucial element to it, in addition to what you're seeing on the football field.
Paul, I have not, as of yet, taken a dive into who will be attending the Senior Bowl. That's something I will obviously be getting to this week. Are there any guys that you're going to have your eye on, any prospects that you're chomping at the bit to see there on the practice field, or are you just taking a 30,000-foot view at this point?
So I do have a couple names to share. Brennan Rupp, he writes for Packers Wire, does a great job diving into the draft process. The draft for Brennan is 24/7, 365.
One of those,
so
right?
while we're dipping our toes in, he's fully in the mix of it. So I asked him for some prospect names in my article at some positions of need for the Packers, and a couple names that he mentioned. Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Azir Thomas from Florida State. He mentioned as guys that could be in play for the Packers in the first early rounds of the draft. Looking at the defensive line, where that could be a priority for the Packers. Actually, saw, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah who's putting together his top 50 big board. He said he has 16 defensive linemen within his top 50.
And I got very intrigued. No doubt
I did
about
as well. And that aligns with what Brennan said in his snip. He said the defensive line, there's no shortage of talent at the Senior Bowl along the defensive front. He mentioned TJ Sanders from South Carolina, Alfred Collins from Texans as potential TJ Slayton replacements if he goes elsewhere in free agency. If the Packers are looking for more of that juice burst, quick twitch, Darius Alexander from Toledo, Walter Nolan from Ole Miss. Last position group I'll mention, wide receiver. No, it's on the radar of many. Sure. Of the Packers, this is from Brennan, of the Packers' 10 wide receiver selections in the draft under Gutekunst, 7 have participated in the Senior Bowl. So within that list, Brennan Rupp put 9 under the wide receiver category to keep your eyes on. Jalen Royals, Utah State, Pat Bryant, Illinois. So there's a good chance, history-wise anyways, that one, maybe more of those players become Packers.
It's going to be fascinating to watch play out throughout this week and throughout the months leading up to the draft in Green Bay. Can't wait. Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate the time. Make sure you check out his work at ESPN LaCrosse. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.